I am recording. All right, I'm going to share my screen. So last week we kind of talked a lot about theology. We talked a lot about, the formation of John Wesley's theology, and it's pretty. It went pretty detailed. It was funny. I was watching the YouTube video and I was almost boring myself to tears. It was kind of convoluted and long, but you really kind of see. And when I look at John Wesley's life, I really see a correlation between him and Luther, right? This constantly belaboring the state of his soul, trying to figure out if he's right with God. And really, that struggle creates his theology, and it creates the foundation of our church, and it creates Wesleyan theology as we know it. So today we're going to be talking a little bit more on just um, we're going to be talking about how the movement continues to expand, but I really want to focus on how the movement um, was involved in social justice, because that's really a huge part of our legacy as Methodists. So here, okay. So John Wesley, towards the end of our last session, he continues to have some discord with the Calvinists and the Moravians in his society. And towards the end, or around 1742, he publishes a document called The Character of a Methodist. And basically, he boils down what a Methodist is, because around this, people are like, what are the Methodists? There is already an Anglican Church. Why is there a separate group? Are they trying to be, a separate church, or trying to be someone that separate from the Church of England, or maybe separate from the state? And there's all this confusion as to who the Methodists are. But he publishes something really important. It's called The Character of a Methodist, and he describes it, and he boils down a Methodist as one who loves God and one who loves their neighbor. Right. So that was just the basic uh, framework of Wesleyan theology. And pretty much she's saying, we could go back and forth, and this could create a lot of division between all the different understandings of theology between Arminianism and Calvinism, and a focus on God's predestination and God's choosing, God's predestining us and choosing, I don't know how to say it, I guess, making God's will happen for us, as opposed to human participation and people playing a part in that. Oh, sorry. So that's a constant tension, but he boils it down and he says, sorry, there's something happening with my screen. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna unshare. Okay, I'm gonna reshare, sorry. Okay, so so basically that's what he says. He says, the basic question is, do you love God and do you serve your neighbor? So that's what he focuses on going forward. And people repeatedly attack John, and they repeatedly mob the Methodists as they're preaching. One of the rumors was that he's a Catholic sympathizer. And this is happening because the societies are growing. More and more people are converting. They're doing open air preaching. And George Whitefield is also building momentum in this. So people were thinking that he was a Catholic sympathizer. Maybe he's siding with the American colonies to overthrow the state, and all these kind of crazy, salacious rumors about what the Methodists were doing. So they were attacked, they were persecuted, they were regularly, mobbed, and but still they kept going, and they kept growing, and they started to build societies, and they started to build a certain kind of polity. So what they did was, as these societies were growing, they needed preachers. So John Wesley would recruit preachers, and they would practice, and they would critique each other. And if they showed promise, he would send them on a circuit. So these preachers would go on circuits, and as the number of preachers grew, they created something like a conference that they would meet every year. So the first conference was in 1745, and that's when John Wesley would talk to them about theology, would talk to them about polity and doctrine. And it was like an annual conference. So people say this is like the first Methodist annual conference, where all clergy come together and they discuss issues of the church, they discuss issues of theology, rules, how things are going to change. And that's not much different than our annual conference today, where lay leaders and clergy come together, and they do that, they order the church. So as this is happening, the um, the societies and the groups, taking kind of copying the model of what the Holy Club did, they continue to preach and to visit prisons, even people on death row, which was considered highly unusual. So you had people that were, on their last minutes of life, and it was kind of gory, but these things were public. They would be, there'd be public like executions, like someone would be hanged, or something like that. And Methodist preachers would go and preach to the person that was on death row, and that was considered very strange and very unusual. From there, they created a preaching house, school, and infirmary all in one, called Newcastle. And basically, this Newcastle is one of the poorest places in England, and where a lot of the miners, you know, people, day laborers, live there. And it was a very dangerous place. And they created a school right there. And as these societies were growing, one of the issues was they would say, okay, I want to go to church. And these were people that didn't go to church typically on a Sunday. But once they would enter church, they would get expelled, or they would get kicked away from the table. So the Heizenreiter book, quotes, when the poor colliers, so coal miners of Kingswood, were repelled from the table by clergy in Bristol, Charles, in spite of his churchly inclinations, proceeded to administer the sacrament to them in unecclesial settings in Kingswood. So, as these people were getting saved and wanting to go to church, they would get kicked out. So that's why these societies were so important, because they were able to give the sacraments, to administer communion to all these people that would not be welcomed in a typical high church setting. So here, this is a picture of a Methodist preacher. I don't know if you see it on a wagon. This is somebody, I don't know, somebody's going to death row. There's crowds of people following, and you have this Methodist preacher preaching in this chaotic scene. And that's another reason, people think that this was very unusual, that one, not only are you trying to go to prisons and talk to prisoners, but you're actually doing it to people that are considered the worst offenders. So from there becomes more and more ways in which these Methodist societies engage in social justice. So as the Methodist revival continues to grow, one of the issues was in the beginning of the Methodist movement, most of the people were very well off and, educated and well-to-do. If you remember, the Methodist movement started in Oxford, right? The Holy Club, right? So these are very educated, well-to-do people. But as the revival grows, there's obviously a huge disparity, or huge difference between classes. And John Wesley becomes very clear that there needs to be aid and help for some of these people in the societies. So one of the things that he did was, there was a really bad frost in 1740 that came through Bristol, and so many people lost their crops, and they were really on the last leg. And they did a collection and they were able to feed 150 people, um, each day during this time period because of this collection. And this becomes part of the DNA of these Methodist societies. Another thing that he did was he created a common stock program. So in the societies, he would say, if you have extra of anything, bring it to the society. So you have, an extra blanket, you have an extra pot, if you have something that you could spare, bring it so that people who don't have a pot or people that need an extra blanket could take it from this stockpile. He created like a kind of short term borrowing program, like a microloan program in the society. So, obviously, a lot of these people were living day to day, so if, your wagon broke down, or if, your house caught on fire or something terrible happened, they didn't have, savings and things to fall back on. So he created a program where he would collect funds, and financial stewards would loan out that money at very low interest, and they would have to pay that back within 3 months. So this program assisted 250 people the first year that they started it. So the Foundry was one of the main societies that John Wesley founded, and that's like the society in London. And one of the things that he wanted to do was, one of the things he became very aware of was a need for medical attention for a lot of these people. A lot of these people were not well enough to see a doctor or go to the hospital, not too different from society today. But one of the things he grew up on and he learned about and he continued to study were homeopathic remedies. So he really wanted to give a seminar to people that couldn't afford to go see the doctor or go to the hospital. He wanted to give a seminar explaining how to create your own remedies. So a lot of people started to come. So it says, he did it on Fridays. And then he actually collected a lot of these solutions and these remedies, and they were available to people. And so if somebody said, "Oh, I have a cough," and he would be like, "Oh, well, I have soaked licorice, that was soaked for 20 hours. You take this." And they would give out these remedies. Over time, a lot of these remedies would disappear. There weren't enough. So he published something called the Primitive Physic, and it had recipes for like um, homeopathic remedies, like how to deal with a cough, how to deal with swollen joints, or if you are, if you're dealing with um, you know problems breathing, or if how you should eat, things that you should eat, how to take care of yourself, just basic things. And if you read it, it sounds like very basic, right? He says eat a lot of vegetables, make sure you get this much sleep. But it sounds like very basic things, but a lot of these things people didn't know and they had to learn. And then some of them were kind of strange, like cinnamon bark and licorice and lemon peel and honey, and I don't know, it's strange to me, but maybe that was common back in the day. But it had all these recipes, and basically his concern was, if you can't afford medicine, these are things, anyone could, get honey, anyone can get, a lemon peel and create this on their own. And he was trying to make healthcare accessible. He was trying to make health accessible to the regular person that wouldn't be educated on how the body works, or wouldn't be educated on these remedies. So that was one of the ways. And people say that this is really a great contribution he gave to the common person. um, so many people read this, and it became like the baseline of health. And John Wesley lived to 84, I think 85. He lived a very long life for someone who lived at the time. And one of the things he always said was he followed this regimented um, health kind of system in his daily life, and he publishes it. So people look to him as an authority. He's not a doctor, but they look to him and reference it. And anybody could get this. Anybody could get this, pamphlet and be able to take care of themselves. Another thing that he did was he created houses for women that were widows that had no place to go. So he created two of these houses. They called them poor houses, not to be confused with workhouses. Workhouses were something different. But basically, he wanted to create a neat, clean, safe place for women. A lot of these women had children, and if they didn't have a place to go, they could be safe in these houses. And that kind of rippled out. This effect rippled out, and more of these societies tried to procure places where widows could stay and feel safe and protected. Another thing that John Wesley noticed was, he would be walking around, and during the day he sees kids running around everywhere, right? And he's like, why are there kids running around? And he realizes, oh, it's because the parents can't afford to send their kids to school. So at the foundry, they created a school. So every kid in the area that was just running around during the day, that whose parents couldn't send them to school, they brought them to this to the school at the foundry, and they hired teachers to be able to teach them. Also in Kingswood, also in Bristol, they created a school called Kingswood. So this is a little print of the Kingswood School. So same thing, Kingswood would, Bristol was a very poor area. A lot of the kids couldn't afford to go to school. The parents were working all day, all night. They didn't have time to oversee their education. So those kids were gathered and they were educated at the school. And it's funny, John Wesley gives this, list of subjects, right? And it's very regimented, as you can imagine. He says, he designs the school curriculum to be about, and the quote is, in every branch of useful learning, from the alphabet to those qualifications that would fit for the work of the ministry. The list of subjects is imposing: reading, writing, arithmetic, French, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, rhetoric, geography, chronology, history, logic, ethics, physics, geometry, algebra, music. For the English classes, they wrote all these different. They were instructed in 5 other languages, and John Wesley wrote books publishing grammar. So as you can imagine, this is an education that educated kids don't even get. But the school that they created, these kids were getting a very top-notch education, or a very rigorous education. As you could see, John Wesley really believed that education was so important. So one of the things that we talked about, I think it was the last session, was how the Methodist societies were organized. So they were organized in societies, which societies could be 50, 60 people. It could be bigger than that. But there were also classes. Classes were around 12 people. And there were bands. Bands were about five or six people. But classes were pretty much created, and there was no, it was like mixed gendered, mixed age, but it was basically who lives next to you. So people that lived in your community. So it was, your neighbor, a few houses down, the house around the block, maybe your cousin that lived down the road. It was, it was a group of about 12 people, but that's created because they wanted to collect funds for charity on a regular basis. So they design these classes because if you're going to collect money, these people have to live next to you. If you're going to, meet the needs of your community, if you're going to talk about how to serve your community, these people have to live next to you. They have to be in your community. So that's why classes were designed this way. So what they did was they were always collecting funds, and these funds were distributed to various charities, to people in need in the community, people who needed food, people who needed shelter or whatever it was, and also to support the school and the other ministries in the societies. These funds were collected and they were dispersed. Another thing that John Wesley was he was a very strong proponent of the abolition movement in Britain, and also from afar, he was very opposed to slavery in the US. in the Americas. So one of the things, one of the rules in order to join a society was you could not own a slave. So that was, one of the first questions they would ask. If you wanted to join a society, a Methodist society, they would ask you, do you own a slave? And if you owned a slave, you could not join, because that just seemed like a complete oxymoron. There's no way that you could say, I want to grow in my faith and I want to be a disciple of Christ, or I want to, have a closer relationship with God and own a slave. That was just incompatible. So that was one of the first questions that people would ask. And there was a real stigma to owning slaves in British Methodism. If you did own a slave, if you gave up your slaves and you joined a society, people would still call you an ex-slaver. There was a real stigma to it. So even in John Wesley's journals, he would be like, I met with William, that ex-slaver. It kind of follows you, the fact that you had once, owned slaves. So he was really against slavery, throughout his ministry. Was spoke out against it. One of the great tensions later on, as the Methodist movement starts growing in the Americas, one of the tensions is, in the colonies, they're saying, the British government is oppressing us, and the British government is not giving us our freedom, and doesn't want the he doesn't believe in American independence. He's a loyal, British Anglican clergyman, and one of the things that he says is, how can you talk about uh, oppression when you guys have slaves? And he wrote this pamphlet, or this address, called A Calm Address to the American Colonies. And he quotes, "Do you not observe wherever these ballers for liberty govern, there is the vilest slavery?" So he's saying it's ironic that you guys keep crying about oppression from the British government, when you are the root, you have the root of the vilest form of slavery that humanity has ever seen. And that's kind of the tension that kind of starts as the war is about to start, and the British and the colonies are about to break off. And eventually he does send Francis Asbury, and he does ordain, and he sends Coke to ordain as a bishop, to ordain clergy in the Methodist movement in America. So we'll get to that. But there is that tension. And part of that tension in the beginning is because of American slavery. So one of the last letters that he actually writes was to William Wilberforce. And he writes this letter, saying, um, so William Wilberforce was trying to abolish slavery in Britain. So it does get abolished, I think, in 1807. Um, but he says this. He says, "Go in the name of God, and in the power of his might, till even American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun, shall vanish away before it." Right? And he wrote this pamphlet called "Thoughts Upon Slavery." It's a really short, it's like 100-page, really short. It's small. I encourage anyone to read it. It's available on the internet. But basically, he dismantles every argument that is for slavery. So some of the arguments that justify the slavery is that these people came from a barren wasteland. They had no culture. They were savages. So we're pretty much doing them a favor. And in his pamphlet, he explains that most of these slaves came from the Congo and Angola, and he really lays out that the land was plentiful and it was beautiful, and that these people had their own culture, their own kind of way of governing themselves. They had tribes, they had, leaders, and he kind of equates the titles to, in terms that, a British person would be able to understand. Basically, he's saying that these people were fine, and you took them and you forced them into slavery. He also outlines the history of slavery in Europe and how, by the 1400s, slavery was pretty much, had disappeared. And then you had the Spanish that came to, South America, and they enslaved the natives there. And then that started the ripple effect of, the colonizers taking slaves, and pretty much it came to Britain, and it, is now in the US. So he kind of outlines the history, and he explains, where these slaves came from, how they were procured, just the, how inhumane the whole operation is. And he breaks down every argument. One of the main things is, okay, it's the law. It's legal what we're doing. But he says it doesn't make it right. Just because it's legal, that doesn't mean anything. It's evil, and evil is evil. Another thing that he speaks out against is, he, some of the people that advocate for slavery, especially in the Americas, they were saying that there's no way that the colonies could prosper because it needs free work, because the work is so intense. Sugarcane fields and picking cotton. It would know what you can't pay someone enough to be able to do this work. So if we don't, have slaves, we'll be in financial ruin. And he really breaks down this argument. He's saying you could try other methods. You could try, animals, machines, something. You don't try other methods. You just resort to this evil. So he breaks it down, and I put up some screenshots of, some of the things that he says. Towards the end, his arguments get very drastic, right? He's like, do you have a human heart? Are you human? Have you no sympathy? When you see these things happen, and you know probably he's heard a lot of the stuff about American slavery in the Americas, but I'm sure he was there. He must have seen. He was there for a period of time as well. But he really says, like, how could you think that this is nothing? You know, this is so evil. And one of the things that he talks about in the second screenshot, he talks about philosophers and, people who talk about moral justice, and these people that are so enlightened, but they never reference or never talk about slavery, especially slavery in the Americas, that is so violent, so vile, so treacherous. And then if you read this, he actually goes into depth of like what slaves in America endure. Just the lashings, the being hunted. He really doesn't mince words. He explains, how terrible uh, it is, and the grand plea is it is authorized by law. And then he says, that doesn't make it right. And he breaks down that argument. He dismantles it more and more. So yeah, it's a really great read. I think you know, it's very convicting. It's very sharp worded. But basically his thoughts on this, this pamphlet gets published and passed around, really becomes ingrained in the Methodist movement, in Britain anyway, that slavery is wrong, it is vile, it is treacherous. Unfortunately, as we know from our Methodist history, slavery continues on even with the Methodist Church that continues to grow, and in the U.S. and eventually in American Methodism, it splits multiple times because of the issue of slavery. So there was definitely this stigma surrounding slavery in the British societies and in British Methodism. That same stigma is not does not translate in America, unfortunately. Okay. So towards the end, around the 1740s, the whole of the Methodist movement continues to grow. There are many, many revivals. John Wesley preaches all throughout England. He visits Ireland. He, travels everywhere. And around 1749, he and George Whitefield, and the Wesleys and George Whitefield have a reconciliation, and they make a truce, and they eventually kind of patch up their relationship. So it's kind of like a decade long kind of back and forth kind of tension that they had. And then towards the end of John Wesley's ministry, I wouldn't say the end because he lived for a long time, around 1765. So some time within his ministry, he publishes something called Scripture, the Way of Salvation. So any Methodist clergy person has to read this book in seminary. But basically, he outlines, the basic tenets for his theology. So his understanding of God's grace, God's prevenient, convincing, justifying, and sanctifying grace. So that's the basic pattern of the basic order of salvation. So the Reformed way of understanding it is called the order of salvation. So the Reformers would say this is the order, you can't change it. It's the you first become justified, and then you become sanctified. So like Luther would say, you first accept Christ, and then Christ changes you and moves you. For John Wesley, he kind of changes it a little bit. He changes the language and the nuance. So instead of order of salvation, he calls it way of salvation. So it kind of gives an idea of somebody on a journey, like somebody taking a path and someone walking, a direction. So kind of this idea of it being revealed in front of you. All right. I want to stop share for a second. We're gonna watch a couple videos. Let's see if I can do that. I am really cold. I have like the AC blasting. So I'm kind of like shivering right now and talking. So when I play the video, I'm going to turn off the AC. I don't know if you could tell from my voice. Okay. So the first video we're going to see, I'll just share my desktop. The first video